green. It'll turn gold over time. So
I've had golden bamboo.
that's a special one. That's really good. So let me introduce Shinjin, Michael.
One, just a second, and now you can.
Okay, welcome to Atlanta Soto Zen Center. Sunday morning streaming live, and I believe on Facebook and possibly YouTube. And this morning's guest speaker is Shinjin Mike Goldman, who is manages and oversees, facilitates our guest speaker program. If you have somebody that you would like to suggest that we invite to become a guest speaker, please speak to Mike afterwards. Or if you think you would like to give a talk about Zen in your life, you're certainly welcome to as well. It's always the first Sunday of the month is the guest speaker program. Second Sunday is Just Sit Saturday, which is coming up, and Yoji here runs the 9 to 4, roughly 9 to 4 session, a half-hour period of sit, plus a lunch and learn. Since I'm in Jacksonville next week,
Mike just said he would do it.
next weekend,
I asked Mike, and Mike said that he would.
okay, so Mike Goldman will be the lunch and learn guest next Saturday. So if you'd like to try the longer retreat, sitting basically all day long, most of the day.
A person can break that up as however they want to do it.
You come for the afternoon or for the morning. And lunch and learn, the food is always good, even if the Zen isn't so good. So with that, I'd like to, any other comments or announcements anybody has need to bring up?
Oh, just one thing. I'll send out an email for the Just This Saturday. And if any of you don't get it, I know it's like, if you don't get it, let me know. We just got an email system. And so if you're not on the list, or if you didn't get it, let me know. That way I can follow up, see what could be going on.
So that's Shinjin. Could you introduce your talk to us? Tell us what it's going to be.
Sure. I think I know everybody here, but I'm Shinjin, Michael Goldman. I've been here for 22 years now, 23. And today's talk is going to be on the Platform Sutra, which I am by no means an expert. As a matter of fact, preparing for this talk was the first time I'd ever read the entire thing. So we're all going to be stumbling through this together. But some interesting things about the Platform Sutra. It's basically the story of and the teachings of the sixth patriarch of China, Huining. He lived from 638 to 713. And one of his successors was the person that actually compiled this. And apparently the guy named Fei Hai the compilation started at about 700 when Huining was still alive and ended soon after his death in 720. That's what most historians tell us. And that the copies kind of bounced around in varying forms for the next 300 years. But by about in the 1090s was when they had settled on one version, one translation. So before we keep going, do those anything about those dates jump out at anybody?
Can you repeat them, please?
It was first compiled 720, and the definitive version winds up sometime in the 1090s. 1090, about 1090, somewhere in there.
33 stands out.
The Battle of Hastings. Well, we're very far away from Normandy, but okay, think about this. When did Bodhidharma get to China?
400, late 400.
Okay, so this is not very. Huining only lived about 150 years after Bodhidharma did, was when he was teaching. So what would we expect to see in this sutra? It'd be different from what Bodhidharma taught.
More Chinese culture.
More Chinese culture. Where did that come from?
Okay.
There you go. More Chinese culture and more Chinese influence. Okay, so kind of keep that in mind. Okay, what would have happened right around in the 1100s after this sutra had been solidified and was standardized? Bodhidharma gets to, not Bodhidharma, Dogen gets to China. Okay. So
1220s, 1240.
yeah, about 100 years later, Dogen gets to China. Okay, that's really interesting because we'll see. One of the things that makes this sutra so interesting is that it is kind of functions as a bridge between what came before it and what was going to come later. When you read it, you will see all of these things that are, on one hand, echoes of Taoism, and on the other, precursors of Zen as it exists now. One of the reasons that Huining is considered so important is because all schools, even schools that have faded out and teachings that have faded out, allegedly, if you know what historians tell us, can all be traced back to Huineng. So in some ways, you can almost call this guy one of the great fathers of Zen, and that's what this series of talks is the monsters of Zen. So we're definitely on one of the monsters.
Another one, Hongji, was about 100 years before Dogen.
Right.
So Hongji falls right in there, and Hongji was quoted by Dogen more than anybody except Rujing, his direct teacher.
Okay.
So Hongji was right there in that 100 years before Dogen period, 50 years after.
Okay, well, this is kind of a good point to bring up. It was a point that I was going to make later in the talk, but we can insert it right here. We cannot in any way know what Dogen had been exposed to in Japan. But I think we can say with certainty he had read this when he got to China. And you'll see a couple of things that echo that. It's pretty interesting. And it's set up differently from most of the other sutras. And for the first 37 verses were all compiled while Huining was still alive. From 38 to 48, these were, from about 1720 to 730, were his disciples, compiled by his disciples. So people that would have been alive while he was alive and actually heard him say these things. Okay, from 49 to 57, these were followers of Shin, who was the next patriarch, who was probably quoting Huineng. Okay, so we're getting a little farther afield with each ramification. The other interesting thing is that this sutra is kind of divided up into thirds. The first third is Huineng giving us his autobiography. And the middle third is Huineng teaching. And from the teachings, what we can surmise is this set of talks, or this talk that was compiled, was him initiating monks and lay people. So when we talk about the vows that he had these monks and lay people talk, think about the vows we take, think about the vows that we recite when we recite the Heart Sutra, and keep that in mind when we do that. The last third are all anecdotes about Huining. And so it's all people coming to Huining and him being able to answer them. And those get really interesting, even though when we talk about them, there's going to be a common theme that's really interesting. So we look at this. This autobiography that he gives us. And it's called the Platform Sutra because he would have given it sitting on a platform. He would have been talking to as many as it states several thousand people at one time, and he would have been sitting on either an earthen platform or some kind of raised structure so everyone could hear him. And he recounts a story of how he came to understand the Dharma. And what he says was his father had died. His father was kind of a mid-level government administrator. His father died, so he became a woodcutter to support his aging mother. And he was inside of a shop once making a delivery, and some sources say it was the shopkeeper, some say it was someone else, was reciting the Diamond Sutra. And he says he became enlightened when he heard the Diamond Sutra. However, if you go to other translations, it doesn't use the word enlightened. It said his mind became clear. Okay, so there's a difference. So, this whole concept of enlightenment, we can't really know what it was he went through. Whatever he went through was for him. So, enlightenment or not, something happened to him when he heard the Diamond Sutra. How many of you guys have read the Diamond Sutra already? Okay. Well, the Diamond Sutra is quite a bit older than the Platform Sutra, and basically what it is one of the Buddha's followers stands up and says, I have to teach people this Dharma, and they always ask me how to follow the Dharma, how to have a clear and restful, peaceful mind. What do you want me to tell them? And the Buddha says, well, there's things you have to practice. Tell them to practice charity. Tell them to practice kindness. Tell them to practice humility. Tell them to practice perseverance. Tell them to practice tranquility and to practice wisdom. Okay, so basically it was kind of Buddhist practice in a nutshell, in one thing. So that's what Huining heard. And he became somehow very spun up, very enraptured, and grabbed the guy and said, where did you hear that? I need to know where you got this. And he says, well, you need to go to this mountain, this monastery, and talk to this guy. And so Huining does this. He leaves, okay, and leaves his aged mother there. And the first translation, I was like, wow, what a great guy. His mother's, what's she going to do, starve to death? But actually, in another translation, it says that he arranged for the shopkeeper to take care of her. So that's kind of a little interesting side, but that's not in every version. So we're protected from thinking Huining was a complete jerk. But at any rate, so he goes to the monastery and gets an audience with the abbot, who was the fifth patriarch, and says, I've become enlightened. I want to live here. And, now you can explain to me what I went through. Okay. Imagine that for just a second. Okay. It would not be the weirdest thing a beginner has ever said to me. But if I was here on a Wednesday night and I had a beginner walk in here and say, hey, I'm enlightened, I want to stay here and live with you, I would say, yeah, why don't you help Robert clean up for a while? But what the guy did, he goes, you're a Southern, he called him a jungle rat. Okay, so you got to keep in mind, at the time, Northern schools and Southern schools of Buddhism were very different. And the difference is that the Southern schools believed that enlightenment could happen very quickly, in a flash. Sort of like standing in a shop and hearing somebody recite the Diamond Sutra, blam, you're enlightened. Northern schools believe, no, it's years of work, years of practice, and you still may not ever get it. Okay, these distinctions have since died out. But, you had this guy going to a very venerated abbot and saying, I've got it all figured out. Okay.
You said the distinctions have died out in China, or like Rinzai and Soto, or
well, they've since died out in China. We still have distinctions from school to school, but those two distinctions no longer really exist. Yeah. Okay, so he says, I'm going to put you to work in the kitchen for a while. And he put him to work. Some translations say he was like basically a day laborer. Some translations say he was working in the kitchen milling grain. But at any rate, he milled grain, and that's what he did for months on end. So the fifth patriarch decides, I am going to pass on the transmission via a poetry contest. So whoever writes this poem, my favorite poem, that's who I'm leaving all of this to, and that's who will be the sixth patriarch. Okay, what do you think the historical factuality of that probably really is? Yeah.
Some scholars deny it.
Yeah. I mean, to me, it sounds like a prank. And here's
like the plot to a bad teen movie.
Yeah, exactly.
Like a rap off or something.
Like a rap off, and some underdog going, I'm going to make it, man. But here's why, because he had a guy that was like his most obvious successor, this absolutely brilliant guy. And this guy went and wrote his poem on a wall. He didn't present it to the abbot. Here's my poem. He wrote it on the wall so everybody in the monastery could see it. And one of the things that they keep coming back to, a point that they keep coming back to with Huining, is that he was illiterate. They keep saying, I can't read this, I can't read that. And I talked to the sensei about this because I found it a little bit confusing. And sensei had a really great point. They said he might not have been completely illiterate. He might not have just understood the court language. The same way someone in the Middle Ages in Europe might have been able to read whatever dialect they spoke. They couldn't read Latin inside of a church. Okay, so that's a really interesting distinction. But Huining went and got somebody, said, I can't read this poem. Why don't you read it to me? And the poem is actually really simple, not much to it. And basically says, the body is a Bodhi tree. The mind is like a standing mirror. Always try to keep it clean and don't let it gather dust. Okay, not a whole lot there. It's pretty simple. So Huining got this guy that could write and said, here, write this next to it. And said, Bodhi doesn't have any trees. This mirror doesn't have a stand. Our Buddha nature is forever pure. Where do you get this dust? So basically his response to that first poem is, what are you talking about? None of this stuff that you're putting import in really matters. So I kind of interpret it to say is Huining saying Buddha nature is already right here. You don't need to worry about the Bodhi tree. You don't need to worry about the mirror. You're already carrying around it inside of you. And so, yeah, go ahead.
It strikes me, it reflects the Heart Sutra, where when Shariputra was a expert at Abhidharma, and then he's being told that, all these things that you believe in, perceptions, sensations, you're so focused on, none of them actually, they're all empty, actually. And even the Dharma itself is empty. So it kind of mimics.
It really does, doesn't it? Yeah, it really does. That's a really great point.
It just mimics that. I think first.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's not even the first part's wrong per se. It's just a limited understand. It's a conventional.
Half the story.
Okay, you're heading in the direction I wanted to take it, because Fifth Patriarch comes out and sees these two poems. What he says about the first poem, he doesn't say that's bad. He said, that's great for a beginner. But for somebody that's been at this a long time, it's not going to help them. So that's, you were definitely heading in that direction. And then he turns to Huining's poem and goes, this is the guy that's got it. And so he transmits to Huining in the middle of the night, which is a tradition that we still practice for transmission. We do it in the middle of the night. But what he tells Huining, he said, this is not going to be accepted by anybody else here. Okay, you are a Southerner. You practiced in a Southern way. You're illiterate. You haven't been here very long. I want you to take my robes. I want you to get out of town.
So they don't murder him.
So they don't murder you. And Huining says that he was chased by hundreds of other monks. We don't know if that's an exaggeration or not, but it is definitely interesting. So he gets caught by one monk, and the monk says, and Huining says, I don't care enough about these robes. You can take them. The monk says, I don't want the robes. I want the transmission. So Huining transmitted to him. Okay, that is really very unorthodox for how this thing usually went, but it is very interesting. We've got no way of knowing how much of that is historically correct. But I kind of got the impression that it was a little bit of a prank, on the part of the Fifth Patriarch. I mean, I may be totally dead wrong, but
Like hazing.
what's it?
Like hazing.
Sort of like it. I mean, him telling all of these senior monks that have studied with him for years and years, you guys are totally missing the point. This completely illiterate beginner from out of town, he's got it. I gave the whole thing to him. Provocation. I kind of wondered if it was that. Like it was almost reminding me of, Claudius dressing up Caligula at 7 years old as a little general and letting him command troops. Kind of like a little bit of a prank somehow. And I may be totally dead wrong, but that was just the first thing I thought when I read it.
Maybe that's what's going on with our government today.
Yeah.
That's all pranks.
Well, we do have a completely illiterate moron in charge. So, yeah.
Just a point about the illiteracy thing. There is a Chinese, if they were poems, there is a Chinese script called Grass that is used for writing poetry. It's not the conventional Chinese. I have a scroll like that, and a Chinese speaker can't read it.
That's really interesting.
Chinese speaker, completely literate, cannot read Grass script.
That is
That
really
may have
interesting.
been it.
Thank you for that. Yeah. Any I mean, you're the one that can actually read the stuff yourself. Do you know?
Well, I've seen grass script. It's beautiful, and it's like your own cursive that you would write for yourself to take notes. That's basically what it is. It's like only the writer can read it.
So it's like shorthand.
It's like shorthand almost. And I mean, as far as the Chinese goes, you know, it would have been a medieval type of Chinese, which Latin is a really good comparison because you're getting to a point where the language is morphing, but the religious writing is still in classical Chinese, which it's not even how you would speak anymore. Because it's you know, classical Chinese is a monomial language. It's like every word is one character, and Chinese is turning into a language where every word is 2 or 3 characters. So it's just confusing just to read. It's you know, people still can't read it unless you're specially trained.
Another historical point in that one, Dogen was the first in Japan to stop writing these treatises in the court language, which was Chinese. He started writing in Nihongo or Hiragana or whatever is the Japanese language so that his students could read it.
And even Japanese has an ancient text that, you know, nobody uses anymore.
And the Chinese of Buddhism, and specifically is really hard because there's a bunch of phonetically translated words, and they're using words that already exist, but they don't mean what they mean. They mean something in Buddhism.
Right.
You know, it's basically its own language is Buddhist Chinese.
So this is really interesting because, you know, if we distill this conversation down to one thing, it basically means is being illiterate at this time and place could mean a lot of different things.
Yeah.
And so, you know, we're not really 100% sure what they meant when they keep referring to Wei Ning as not being able to read and write.
You know, just a point on that. There are also, as essentially point out, there's also oral traditions that are considered superior to written traditions for various reasons. And you know, the Greek cultures were oral traditions, like
Right.
the Iliad and Odyssey were oral, and so the ancient Hebrews looked down on them and called them illiterate because they were oral traditions. So there's a bit of there's a lot. I think there's a lot of stuff going on there. The other thing that I couldn't find a lot of information on, it was basically a footnote by Red Pine, and it was kind of funny because Joseph and I were talking a couple of weeks ago. We're talking about how come every single thing we research in Zen we wind up back at Red Pine. But one of the things that Red Pine he said is there at this time and place there was also a mystical connotation to being a woodcutter. That anybody that was in the audience probably would have got, you know, that's lost to us. But at the time and place, you know, somebody saying I was a woodcutter definitely had a certain connotation.
Why?
I don't know. I couldn't find that reference anywhere else, but it was something that but Red Pine blows by in a footnote.
Tell me about the wood as element because I think
and this is something Sensei and I were talking about earlier, that in Chinese philosophy at this time, you know, as Westerners, we kind of think of in classical terms 4 elements. Well, to the Chinese, there were 5. They considered wood a separate element. So there may be some relationship there. And I was starting
wood was the only fuel at the time. That's the only way you could have fire. So it was really critical.
Also, Jesus was a carpenter. So that's a type of woodcutter.
Actually probably was not a carpenter, probably because if you go back to the original Greek, the Greek was the word tekton, which means hand worker. He was probably a day laborer.
Okay.
So not technically a carpenter, but you know, still there is some kind of connection with these guys working with their hands, later becoming great mystical teachers.
Most of the day labor at that time was basically building stuff.
There's a long history in our species of mysticism and woodcutting. The sacred groves of the Greeks, in Grimm's fairy tales, there are a number of woodcutters and magical things happen out in there. And I think it comes from a very, very ancient animism involving trees, cutting down trees.
Like Gilgamesh, wasn't he somehow the cypress forest or the cedar forest or something? Didn't that have something to do with the story of Gilgamesh?
Him and his what was his buddy's name?
Companion.
Kindu.
Yeah, Kidu.
Yeah, they lived in the forest.
Yeah.
He left the palace to live in the forest.
Something about I think get my stories all messed up. Lebanese fort cedar or
Cedars of Lebanon.
yeah,
Yeah.
They were supposed to be like a very like cedar in Japan. It was
Yeah.
precious.
Well, I think Carollo's onto something with this idea that we've got. You know, I think what it may be implying is some kind of balance in the brain, not just a thinker, but also a doer,
Craftsman.
a craftsman, and a thinker and a craftsman. You know, the kind of melding together of the two sides of the brain and the body to become a mystic.
Again, it's
That
very
kind of
important to
balance.
remember when we went to Japan, we've gone a couple of times. When you go look at those monasteries and temples,
Yeah, the
I'm a
woodworking.
builder.
is-
My granddad was a house builder, and they had hand tools, and for them it was like a craftsman table saw. That was the most sophisticated power tool he had. So even my granddad and his generation were building houses with hand tools.
Right.
But you go to Japan and you look at these monasteries, and they harvested these cypress trees, and the planks in the floor are like this big, and they run the length of the temple, the length of the building. How the hell do you do that with hand tools?
Yeah.
And these guys, you know, when they say he's a woodcutter, guess what kind of tool he's using?
Yeah.
Right?
Right. Yeah. So there's
Cutting through to something as well.
yeah, there's definitely something there. He didn't tell an audience, of up to a couple of thousand people, I'm a woodcutter, and it not mean something. So that takes us it gets us kind of out of his biography and into what he was teaching. This middle section that is him teaching is him giving what most historians believe, the scholars believe, he is giving not the transmission, but the initiation to a group of monks and a group of lay people. So we can imagine how that must have looked, of him sitting on a platform, his senior students sitting close to him, and then a field of people all waiting to hear what he had to say, and then taking their vows with him, because one of the things he does is he gives them vows and then says to them, repeat this 3 times. Does that sound familiar?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, and you got to keep in mind, most of these people probably couldn't read or write anything. So this is how they were going to remember it. They repeated it several times. That's why this tradition started. That's why we still do it. So he opens up, Fashai, or however you pronounce his name, opens up by saying he sat there and he cleared his mind. And he began to speak, and he said, good friends, you already possess the prajna wisdom of enlightenment. Because your minds are deluded, you can't understand it by yourselves. You need to find a truly good friend to show you the way to see your nature. Good friends, Buddha nature isn't different for the ignorant and the wise. It's just that people are deluded or awake. And when people are deluded, they're ignorant. When they wake up, they become wise. That's really egalitarian. There's no classism in there. There's no differentiation. He's even dropped the differentiation between North and South. Basically, he's saying, you've already got your own Buddha nature. All you need is somebody to point out how and why you're deluded, and you will basically achieve your own enlightenment.
Or gender.
And I think gender is a really important thing, because you look at any depiction of the Buddha, one of the first things you notice is how androgynous it is.
Dogen points this out in Rahe Tokuzu too, the prostration to the attainment of marrow. Not only gender, but age. He said, a 7-year-old girl is a Dharma holder, we prostrate.
Yeah. But some of the things he says, and I wrote this quote down specifically. Give me a second to find it. I can't really read my own writing. But another thing that he said, he goes, the way has to flow freely. Why block it up? The way flows freely when the mind doesn't dwell on Dharma. What does that sound like to you guys?
Don't overthink it.
Well, yeah, absolutely.
All dharmas
But
are marked by emptiness.
what's that?
All dharmas are marked.
All more
by
dharmas are marked by emptiness. But just the way that's worded, what does it remind you of?
You say it again.
The way has to flow freely. Why block it up? The way flows freely when the mind doesn't dwell on Dharma.
To study the self is to forget the self, like
Yeah.
that sort of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, that's there. But the language itself, where does it sound like it came from?
Taoism.
It sounds like Taoism.
Yeah.
Flow
Yeah.
the water, the way.
The way, you just using the word the way.
The flow.
Yeah. And, by your delusions, you're blocking the flow of the way. It's a very heavy Chinese influence here. And you don't see this in the earlier sutras.
And by the
This
time
is-
you get to Dogen, you see him saying the Buddhist way, but the way is still capital W.
Right. So this is what I was talking about when I said, when I read the Platform Sutra, it seems to have soaked up something that came before it, but it's also pointing to something that's going to come after.
Like a bridge, kind
Kind of exactly like a bridge. Yeah, and that's kind of how I started to see this entire sutra, because sitting here in this room, we talk about this concept. We just chanted this whole concept a minute ago, but we wouldn't say it this way. But somebody trained in Taoism would.
Nowadays, we call that an inflection point.
What's that?
We call that an inflection point.
Inflection point. Okay. All right. So, back to what he was doing as he was speaking. He tells that he keeps referring to them as his good friends. My good friends, let us now make 4 boundless vows. Okay. I vow to save all beings, no matter how numberless. I vow to end all afflictions, no matter how countless. I vow to master all teachings, no matter how limitless. I vow to attain Buddhahood, no matter how transcendent. Now, good friends, recite this 3 times. Okay. Does this sound familiar to anybody? Yeah. However, there's one really interesting thing.
You accusing Dogen of plagiarism?
I'm not. No. I decidedly am not. But the thing is, this is even bleaker than the version that we use. This is even more depressing, because one of the things, you look at our 4 vows. One of them is, I vow to enter. Dharma gates are endless. I vow to enter them. That's the one thing we can do. We can't save all beings. We cannot master. We cannot end all delusions. We cannot, we might be able to achieve Buddhahood, but who knows? But this, all 4 of them, you might as well have said, I'm looking at all of you, it's hopeless. So I thought that was really interesting. But basically he goes on to explain each of these. And he says that the idea is that you've got to get rid of your own delusions. Mm-hmm. To him, that's the key. Yeah.
But it coming from someone who had this, what do we want to call it, satori or enlightenment experience from hearing a sutra, it's not hopeless if that's your view that this can happen spontaneously or.
Sure.
But here's the thing that I didn't mention in his autobiography. When his real enlightenment happened was when he was receiving the transmission from the 5th patriarch. Mm-hmm. So what happened in the store we kind of have to assume was not his enlightenment. And different translations don't call it enlightenment. But they all agree that when he received the transmission, he became enlightened.
So was it like a seed or a satori experience that showed him a glimpse of it?
What brought you here?
Me?
Yeah.
I wanted to learn to sit for 5 minutes at a time. I couldn't.
Joel, what brought you here?
Me?
Yeah.
Just
Blair.
yeah,
Blair, I'm
for
sorry, I
one
called you
thing.
Joel. Yeah. Blair. Yeah.
It's all right, empty. Just the putting spirituality as a priority in my life.
Okay. The point I was trying to make is somewhere,
A
somehow.
recognition of an awakening of some need, some interest, some curiosity, something.
Something.
Mhm.
Something. Think hard enough, and somewhere there was a shopkeeper reciting a sutra
Yeah.
that you heard that says, I need to know more about this.
Mm-hmm.
It might not have been that exact thing, but metaphorically, you've got your own shopkeeper. Okay, something in your life said this is not quite right. Where did you go to find that? And you wound up here. Okay, that's not enlightenment, but it's something.
Yeah.
It's the beginning of enlightenment.
It's like way-seeking mind.
It's like, well, yeah, exactly.
There's an interesting 3-step that some teacher taught. He said, first you must do self-renunciation.
Right.
Nobody can renounce your reality but yourself, right? Doesn't mean you have to change your clothes or become a monk. Then you have to do self-awakening. Even Buddha can't awaken you. Then he said you have to do self-clarification. So awakening is not necessarily self-clarifying. So when Nang had this experience hearing this line from the Diamond Cutter Sutra, it hit him like a ton of bricks, but it wasn't self-explanatory.
Yeah.
So we had to go to Hongren to clarify the great matter. Within 9 months, Hongren, affirmed his understanding.
Yeah.
That's quick. He was in his 20s. He was a young guy.
That's amazingly fast. Amazingly fast. Okay, so then he gives him the next set of vows. He says, it will enable you to see the 3-bodied Buddha within you. That's really interesting. The 3-bodied Buddha within you. But then he says, I take refuge in the pure Dharma body in my own material body. I take refuge in the myriad-fold transformation body transformation body Buddha in my own material body. I take refuge in the future realization body of my own material body.
Say that again, please.
No, I can't. No. I take refuge in the pure Dharma body Buddha in my own material body. I take refuge in the myriad transformation body in my own material body. I take refuge in the future and perfect realization body in my own material body. Okay, so he is getting really deep in here. This was one of the only parts, usually when I read the sutras, especially when I read the Indian literature, I am thinking, what in the hell are you talking about? And we have plenty of examples of that all the way through the Japanese literature. And one of the things that I really liked about the sutra is there's not a lot of crazy metaphor that probably meant a lot of stuff then, but we can't figure out. I do not know what the stone lady dancing means. Obviously there's something about a heron being reflected in a bowl of snow that meant something to the people hearing at that time that's pretty opaque to us. This is the most opaque part of the whole thing.
What's interesting, he's taking refuge in the 3 bodies, the 3 kaya, rather than the 3 treasures, which we take refuge in the 3.
We take, yeah, exactly. So anybody have any ideas on this? I can only come up with one.
Well, it's a different level. It's a level of more profound wisdom that he's describing, because conventionally we can always take refuge in the 3 dharmas. It's very simple, but this takes it to a deeper level where all reality is permeated by this view.
It's a time.
I really like that. I hit on something different yesterday, and this may not hold any water, but I definitely like that a lot. Your brain basically functions in 3 different sections: the right hemisphere, left hemisphere, and then you got a brainstem. And each one, the brainstem controls the body. Your right side of your brain is controlling your emotional center. Left side's is controlling your intellectual. So you've got
I would object to the word control.
Control. Okay, fair enough. Monitors. Regulates. So what you've got, somebody that's in total balance is living in their body, and they've got a balance between their intellect and their emotional life.
Plus the instinctual.
The instinctual is going to fall in the body,
on the stem, right?
In the brainstem. So, you take refuge in all 3 of those at the same time. I mean, because somebody, a brilliant scholar, even a brilliant scholar of the life sciences at this time and place would not have known what the function of the brain does.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just what struck me. I mean, maybe totally off, but that's just what struck me.
If it is shedding aspects of the Vedantic thought or the mind only school, you know, in India you had these God intoxicated masters, and so this would be a rejection of that. This would be saying that's one type of enlightenment, but it's kind of a dead end because you're not balancing it out in these different. You're just intoxicated with God, which whatever that is, but you're not bringing that into your instinct, into your intellect.
No longer in the real world.
You're no longer in the world.
And it's also kind of laying the basis for tantric thought that would blossom in Tibet not too long after this, maybe 200 or 300 years.
I have a comment on the three, but let's see if anybody else has. Before we read it.
To me, it's also laying the seed, you know, that's a common theme throughout Soto Zen. It's tougher to commit to this path as a layperson than it is as a full-bore resident monk. If all you have to worry about is this, you can get God intoxicated, like you just said. But if you're going to do this and function in the real world, you know, you're going to have to get your intellectual life, your emotional life, your body life straightened out. What's the best way to do that? Keep sitting. Keep sitting. Carol, are you going to say something?
Well, I like your idea because I don't think you need to be a neuroscientist to recognize that we eat, we think, and we feel. And so these are three aspects: our survival body, our thinking body, our feeling body. I don't think you need modern neuroscience to figure that out.
I agree completely.
This is a recognition of the humanity of the people he's talking to.
I think you're dead right. I don't think he would have been, you know, I think one of the things that makes Zen so incredibly interesting or makes Buddhism period interesting, is you can look at the things that the Buddha said and how they play out now in terms of neurobiology, neuropsychology. Now we kind of have better understandings of what the brain does, how it works. You know, at the time when the Buddha was teaching, he didn't know what an amygdala was or what it did, or prefrontal cortex. But now, you know, we can see the effects that sitting has on those two things.
Well, Huineng was talking to lay people here.
Yeah.
And I think the reason he got the robe was because he wasn't one of these in his head people like the guy he bested in the poem, who was kind of a, you know, I'm too good to work sort of guy. And Huineng, having pounded rice and cut wood and done all of these things, had an understanding that work means eating, that you cannot subtract yourself from the real world, that you can't just go sit on a mountain. You need to sit, but you need to sit in the marketplace. It's like the ox pictures, you know,
Right.
The ultimate is to be able to live in the world. And this was Buddha's essential teaching. He didn't think that much of monks because they were hiding from things in some ways. That to be really engaged, you have to be in the real world and not just sitting somewhere.
That's you just set up the next 5 minutes of the talk.
Sorry.
No, brilliant. I loved it. But as we go through, and you know, this is a very long sutra, so trying to cover this all in an hour and allow time for everybody's really wonderful comments and discussion. You know, we're not going to be able to get through it. So, you know, we're just going to kind of compress everything from here on out. But the thing that Huineng keeps coming back to, and this is kind of where his teaching, when he was giving the initiation to these lay people, and what I kind of call the best of Huineng at the end part, you know, what I refer to as the box set or the greatest hits record, you know, were anecdotes that his followers remembered. And there was two sets. There was one set that was compiled by his disciples, and then another set that was compiled by his disciples' disciples. He keeps returning back to this theme of practice. You have to practice. Okay. And there's a historical account. Sensei knew a lot about it. I do not, but we couldn't remember if it was attributed to Huining or not. But one of the things that he did at one point to prove this point was he gathered up all of the writings and commentary by his teacher and burned them in a public place. You know?
Yeah, that's another guy that we know. One of the stories, there's a painting of him burning the sutras. He tried to make the point that all of the people of the time, all the people practicing at the time, were getting way too erudite, way too hung up on the intellectual teachings, the written teachings, and he was burning them to make that point.
Yeah. So when he was finished with these vows, and his audience had taken the vows, he'd repeated all these 3 times. One of the things he tells them, he said, you know, is why you're having to do this. He says, it is through self-realization that Buddhahood is attained. That is the power of making vows. I thought that was really interesting because I remember one thing Corolla told me 16, 17 years ago. She says, the vows are pure. They're not puritanical. Yeah, and I've never forgotten that. But, you know, and then Sensei added on to that, he goes, the only way you're going to understand the vows is by breaking them. Okay, so he's basically giving this audience, you know, this is your path. This is your path toward realization. And he even says at another point, he says, I'm paraphrasing it here, but he admonished his followers. He said, look to your own body as your true nature. Okay, he keeps telling these people, he keeps driving this point home, it's already in here, you've already got it. The only reason you can't see it is because you're struggling with your own delusions. Look to yourself. Take these vows because these vows are what is going to transform you, but you're only going to understand these vows when you don't get it right. But that's more or less okay because it's going to lead you to more self-knowledge. And self-knowledge is what's crucial here. Self-knowledge is not hiding anywhere in a sutra. It's not in a book. It's already inside of you. This is a pretty heavy thing to tell a bunch of peasants. It's a pretty heavy thing to tell anybody. But I think that that's one of the reasons why the Platform Sutra is so important, why we're still reading it, why Red Pine bothered to write a book this thick on it. So that's pretty amazing stuff, if you ask me. The anecdotal section, and each one of these anecdotes is almost identical. It's weird how similar they are. Someone comes to Huining and says, I'm confused by this section of a sutra, or I'm confused by this teaching. Huining answers, I can't read it. Recite it for me and I'll tell you what it means. Okay, that's really interesting. So he's putting this person on the spot, and they have to recite or read this section of the sutra, and then Huining gives his commentary. And some of the commentaries are pretty interesting, but they all keep coming back to the same thing. He says the same thing over and over again. You got to practice. It's not about what you learn. It's about what you practice. Okay. So I think in terms of our modern look at Soto Zen, one of the things that we all agree on is that sitting actually changes the brain itself, changes the function of the brain. Reading sutras is not going to make that change happen. Sitting, dealing with yourself is what's going to make the change real, make that transformation. To study the self is to study the way.
Another point around forgetting the self, we think of Zazen as a process of unlearning what we think we already know. So all of these scholars and pundits that would come to Huineng, and the ones who came to Bodhidharma, they had all this erudition and learning. And what we do is unlearn. We unlearn all of that until we can get down to a brute level of reality.
So,
Laurel had something.
yeah.
I was kind of paralleling that with what Martin Luther did to the Protestantism. Yeah, how you didn't have to go through the Pope.
Yeah.
To heaven or whatever. So this is isn't this kind of the same?
Well,
bringing it to the people.
It's the same thing. It's the same thing everywhere. You know, what was Jesus doing? He was telling them the Roman occupation of the temple is not the important part. The important part is you're carrying this thing called the kingdom of God inside of you. So it's essentially the same message. You know, and at the time when China's involved in a massive civil war, potentially every bit as dangerous. But the scene of his death is kind of interesting. He's got the monks gathered around him. He knows he's dying, and he tells them, he just says, "Be well, I'm leaving now. And after I'm gone, don't engage in the worldly customs of crying and accepting condolence money and wearing mourning garments. They would not be the Buddhist way, and you would not be my disciples. Act the same as when I was here. Sit together in meditation, but remain free of movement and stillness, birth and death, coming and going, right and wrong, present and past. Be at ease, be at peace. This is the great way. And after I'm gone, just practice in accordance with the Dharma, the same as when I was with you. And if I were here and you disobeyed my teaching, even my presence would be of no help."
That's pretty brutal.
But it's brutal and it's beautiful in a way. What were the Buddha's last words? "Oh, my monks, be a light unto yourself." He's saying the exact same thing. Yeah, I mean, he's warning them. Look, these teachings aren't me. You know, you're not. Following me alone does not make you a better anything. You've got to do this for yourself. You've got to practice. So he keeps returning to that, and there's a little bit of commentary toward the end. It just says that at that point he entered nirvana, and the writer of this last section just says, "But only those who transmit this teaching, who vow to practice, and who don't retreat from difficulty, and who are able to bear the hardship, and who are rich in blessings and virtue. If their capacity should be inadequate or their ability insufficient, though they seek this teaching, they cannot possibly penetrate it, and it would be a mistake to give them the Platform Sutra. Let this be known to all fellow practitioners that they might fathom its hidden meaning." And thus ends the Platform Sutra of the direct teaching of the Southern School of the Supreme Mahayana in one volume. So that's the last line. So once again, we're admonished, practicing is the key. And I talked to Sensei about this, and Sensei said, well, this pendulum keeps swinging back and forth, where you have enlightenment meaning great scholarship. And then the pendulum, other teachers say, no, don't worry about the scholarship, it's all the practice. And it keeps going back and forth. Throughout history. And even all the way back to the beginning. You think about when the Buddha transmitted. Who did he transmit to? He transmitted to Mahakapasha, because he held up a flower and Mahakapasha smiled. There was no verbal anything. There was no scholarship, no nothing there. Ananda, who was this great genius with a photographic memory, who memorized, we have the Buddha's sutras because Ananda could memorize them. He wasn't transmitted to by the Buddha, so it was not through the intellect. So we have almost the same story with Wei Ning. He was transmitted to because he circumvented this intellectual side of it and penetrated it directly. And I would even posit he penetrated directly because of this great balance in all three sections of his psychology. His body, his left brain, his right brain, instead of just all in the intellect.
You think it's like because the way it swings is just whoever at the time is able to carry it, either coming from the intellectual, because it's different for everybody.
It's different for everybody. Yeah. I mean, all you have to do is, if anybody's ever taken the Enneagram test, that's one of the things it does. It divides up how much of your brain function is in each of those three triads. But I think that, things come into vogue, just like anything else. But, one of the things that Sensei said when we were talking, because I went to Sensei because I said, I'm supposed to talk about this. I got a lot of questions, and Sensei says that with Dogen is one of the places where the pendulum quit swinging. Dogen says, you got two approaches, use them both.
Dogen's more balanced.
More about balance.
But also remember in the cultures that were these settings, if Shenhui, when he won the debate that established Huineng as the legitimate sixth patriarch after Hongren, that means all the land grants, all the government largesse, everything came to them. This was not just intellectual. I mean, Buddhism and government and all of that were all one big mishmash. It's not like today where we try to say government is separate from religion, and it wasn't like that, right? So there were consequences as to who was going to carry forward. So naturally, a person who was very intellectual and very able to memorize and recite and so forth, naturally that would be what's important, right? Mm-hmm. Because then we get the TV shows and we get the land grants, we get the government approval, right? Which is necessary for the propagation of our lineage. So this wasn't simply a bunch of philosophy ideas. This was all integrated with the society at the time.
Well,
so
that's kind of that brings us to an interesting point about what makes the platform different from most other sutras. Is this is part of that debate. Yeah. So one of the things you would do is you'd put this really cool biography of the main guy in the story.
That's how Shen Hui won the debate, and then they were supported by the government. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been.
Yeah, and this humble woodcutter, achieving enlightenment within 9 months, or the sudden snap of enlightenment, and winning this poetry contest and being chased by hundreds of crazed monks trying to steal his robe. That's and then having pithy things to say on his way out the door. That's a pretty interesting story. It's a good, how much of it is historically accurate, it's probably not even the point.
Mm-hmm. One of the technical points, the reason it's called a sutra, it's kind of lack of humility involved in that.
Yeah.
Only Buddhist teaching are called sutra. Everything else is shastra, commentary about this matter, right?
Yeah.
Because Huineng was enlightened without a teacher, without any study, without any meditation, just by overhearing this line from the Diamond Cutter Sutra, his teaching was then considered sutra, which means like the thread of truth running through, because it came from a genuine organic place. It wasn't from something he learned from his teacher. He didn't have any teachers. Mm-hmm. Buddha had no teachers. Buddha had a lot of teachers, but they didn't teach him this. No, right. Buddha wasn't a Buddhist any more than Christ was a Christian, but what he taught became what we now call Buddhism. His very first sermon was the first instance of Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha all coming together at one time. But he did not come from a Buddhist background. There wasn't any more than Christ came from a Christian background. There wasn't any Christianity before Christ. So it's important to understand the reason this is called sutra is it came from that direct experience with no preparation, no groundwork, nothing. Just like Buddha had a lot of preparation, groundwork, and so forth, and other practices, but nothing worked. He was an ascetic at the time of his profound enlightenment. But before his enlightenment, he took the goat's milk. So each of them are considered that kind of transitional figure, that he's the only one that I know of in the history of Buddhism that is also, his teaching is called sutra for that reason.
Yeah, because if you go through this, you've got all of the Indian literature, and then blam, you've got the platform sutra, and that's it as far as sutras go.
It does not begin, thus have I heard.
And it doesn't begin, thus have I heard. It basically begins with, let me tell you about Huineng, So, yeah. But the Diamond Cutter Sutra begins with, thus have I heard that. Yeah, and so he would have heard that.
Yeah.
So does that wrap it up for you, Mike?
That wraps it up for me.
Let's just go around once and give everybody a chance to say something. Andrew, you got something?
Well, in the interest of monsters of Zen, one of the great monsters of film lore was the mummy. And so can you tell us about Wei Ning the mummy?
Wei Ning the mummy, after Wei Ning died, they did mummify him. And you can find lots of pictures of it online. He looks like a little plastic Yoda with no ears. And there is some controversy of whether that's actually him or not. But, you know, we can assume for the sake of argument that it is. So you can actually, if you wanted to spend the money and time and effort, you could actually go see Wei Ning, and he's kind of crouched over about like this and bald and kind of this weird brown color because I think he's been shellacked so many times.
Sure, he's kind of sitting.
He's sitting in
still
Zazen.
practicing.
He's still practicing. So that's the thing. He's still there practicing. Yeah.
Practice your muscles.
Yeah. Okay.
Let's just go around the room, give everybody a chance to grow anything further.
Yeah, I do. If you read the history of calligraphy in Europe, the text starts out pretty plain and then it gets more and more elaborate. And then the scribes revolt and go back to a simpler form. And I think all of these monsters that we've talked about, including Martin Luther and Dogen and Huineng, are people who, when denounced to some extent the unnecessary elaboration and went back to what really matters. That Huineng, in a sense, was a revolt against the over-intellectual
reformers
stuff at the time. Dogen was in exactly the same light, that he did not care for the Zen that was in Japan at the time because it was too florid, it was too complicated.
And
too formal.
Because of that, he couldn't get his questions answered.
Right, it interfered with the actual practice. And just like Martin Luther, the church was getting in the way of people's salvation.
Right.
And to Huineng, all of this bureaucracy, this florid poetry was in the way of the direct transmission. So I think that is the common theme of all of these people, is that they went, whoa, this is too complicated. Let's get back to what really matters.
Luther
And,
himself was a reformer.
and what really matters, you're already carrying around inside you. You
Right,
just don't.
you got it. and
You got it, you
don't
just
need
don't
all
know.
this other crap.
So your name again, tell everybody your name again.
Cheryl,
Cheryl.
Cheryl.
And Cheryl, you come from some background in Zen.
just occasional. My main practice has been for a very long time Tibetan Buddhism.
So any commentary or question for Mike?
Yeah, it's sort of, in my tradition, we make a big deal out of dual teachings and non-dual teachings, and this seems like a non-dual teaching to me, and that's why it's so different, because it's an esoteric teaching, and most people are practicing the exoteric tradition, like the incense, chant a few things, and you're good to go. But this shows the identity of self with the sacred, the divine, the Buddha, whatever, however you want to describe it. And this very radical thought, this non-dual thought.
Yeah, it is. It is. And I think you can kind of get the feel throughout history why it was a really dangerous thing to tell a bunch of people, especially a bunch of peasants. That your life is not a piece of garbage. You're carrying around
Politically.
Yeah.
Radical.
Yeah.
The Tibetan, I lived with Tibetan peasants for a long time, and they do understand that teaching. Because they've had so much exposure to the Dharma. They
Wow.
get it.
That's great.
Thank you.
Glad you're here.
Goji?
Again, I think that, with all the great teachers, at least the ones we listen to, the common thread of truth is practice.
Yeah.
Practice. And, Dogen, basically, we can do all this stuff, but really, you don't have to do all this stuff. It's just the practice.
Well, I think Dogen's a really great example, because if you pile up all his writings, it's about this. And you'd say about 70% of it are on the mechanics of sitting. not a whole lot of philosophy in there. There's nothing like you mentioned the word esoteric. There's not much esoteric in there. It's mostly how to sit and how to behave in the monastery.
And since they always talks about it's just the most simplest way of getting it, it's just sitting.
Yeah. Well, Dogen said enlightenment's like an enormous building with lots of doors and windows. Sitting's the front door.
So let's jump to the front row. Why don't you give everybody your name as we go, so everybody.
Yeah, I'm Brendan. I just really liked the part of the story where all the monks were chasing him after he got the Dharma transmission.
I would have loved to have seen that.
Yeah. What did they think was going to happen? Like, I don't know.
I think, you know, the what this basically tells us is they were so angry at them giving this upstart illiterate the transmission that was just more than they could handle.
I think didn't he go into hiding for 7 years after that too?
Apparently the hiding part is like, there's a lot of controversy on how long he actually stayed hidden and whether or not he was actually hidden.
Okay.
Yeah, so none of the texts really agree on that.
He just had his hands like this.
Yeah.
You can't see.
Beard.
He grew a beard in a mustache.
Yeah.
Let his hair go.
Yeah.
So back row, everybody your name, please.
I was interested in what it meant being illiterate, and I'm interested to look into that.
Yeah.
And also that when he was asked questions, that he asked the person to recite because he can't read. That kind of sounded like it would make the person who asked to repeat it themselves. So it's kind of like the interaction for them to really grasp it, maybe.
You suggesting you could secretly read, but
Maybe.
you
Well,
I'm curious to look into what it did mean.
because one of the best ways to understand something is to explain it to somebody else as simply as you can. Yeah.
Or just realize the questions that you don't have to ask the question you're asking.
Yeah.
Mute. Questions mute.
Right.
Sometimes when you say the question, you get the answer.
You get the answer. Yeah, you get the answer yourself. Yeah.
Bring me your mind and I will pacify it.
Right. Well, that's one of the things that he says in this translation. You know, at the very end of this anecdotal part, he, you know, tells all of these villagers, he goes, if you want to know the answer, if you've got questions, come up to the monastery and I'll make them go away. He doesn't say I'll answer them. He goes, just bring me your questions, I'll make them go away. Yeah. You know, so I was like reading that and I was like, wow, it's the very first consulting firm. Yeah, but I thought that was a really interesting distinction. It's not that I'm going to answer them. I'll make them go away. Yeah. So it may be part of that you're, yeah.
Joseph, anything further?
Thank you.
Jack?
Yeah, my name is Jack. I do like the original poem, the sort of rap out of there. And I think it's helpful to think about because you can think about it like the mirror. So his retaliation was there's no stand for the mirror and there's no place for the dust to gather. And that's good if you ever build your own kind of like spectrum or dichotomy that you can't get out of, either from when you're sitting or just trying to live your life. You can think of it like, well, it's probably not, there probably isn't an actual stand for the mirror I'm worried about. Or
right.
This probably doesn't even need to, there's no place for this dust to even go, which is either your reminder to go back to sitting or to just do the action you're trying to do.
Yeah.
Whether it's from your work or interacting with your family or something like that, the dust you're worrying about probably isn't even, real, or it's composite, or it needs a whole bunch of other things to exist.
I kind of thought one of the things that was really interesting was when, the abbot said, yeah, that poem's fine for beginners. It's sort of like a lot of this stuff. Maybe this is all training wheels. And once you become more and more adept, this isn't as necessary. But, as beginners,
Dogen said that specifically. He said, without engaging in incest, offering, bowing, chanting Buddha's name, repentance, or reading scripture, you should just wholeheartedly sit.
Yeah.
That's drop away body.
Right.
So, Tom, anything further?
Well, I'm glad we have a 3-body problem.
Yeah.
Because the 3-body problem is supposed to be the most difficult problem in all of physics, and it's also the part of the Platform Sutra that you had a difficult time with.
Mm.
Well,
she's the physicist, not me.
Well, it's insoluble.
Yeah, it's because when you have 3 gravitational bodies, it's like the math is just too complicated.
It can't be solved, or it's very difficult to solve.
I think of these as more like a Venn diagram.
Yeah.
Yeah, and with these, I found this 3-body problem to be much more soluble than that.
Right.
I thought it was interesting, the idea that there's the past and there's the future Buddha nature in that 3 where you can look at the past Buddha nature, the Bodhi seed inside of you and the body that you're born into, and know that it nourishes you, and you can take solace in that. And then you can look at the future Buddha's body that you know exists, and you know it exists because the past like Buddha nature exists.
Right.
So you can take solace in the future Buddha nature and know that you're moving towards that, but you don't really have access to either of them, but you have access to the myriad, which you can take solace in because you can take solace in the past and the future.
Okay. All right. I like that.
So, Blair, anything further?
That's Joel.
Yeah. We'll get it right. No, I haven't. This was just a really interesting thing to come and sit in on, because all of my reading and studying of Buddhism has been just, learning about meditation itself. So I don't have the background or the knowledge to talk too much on these subjects. I'm just going to.
You're better off beginning with wisdom.
Right.
Yeah.
Sort of just, but it's great to sit here and hear this kind of intellectual back and forth on the historical side of things, and to know that even Buddhism might suffer from some of the same problems as other religions do. I mean, it sounds like transmission to some monks was basically like a power grab, and that's why they chased him down to try and steal his robes. I mean, if you're waiting around for that long, you might have some sort of feeling of entitlement to all the things that you'd be admonished with.
We've seen it. Those of us who've been here for 20 plus years have seen that exact thing happen.
Right. Mm-hmm. And you would not want to pass down to somebody who just felt like they were next in line, like waiting for the patriarch of the family to die so you inherit all their wealth.
Right. Yeah.
That's you want to pass it to somebody that's a little more purity and somewhat of an innocence to them.
Yeah, I got the same impressions when I was reading that part. I mean, it didn't happen by accident. He did it for a reason.
We're the opposite. You think like Suzuki passed on to Baker Roshi. He was like the least innocent guy in the Sangha.
Yeah.
But that's what it needed. They needed that guy at that point in history, a dynamic, kind of lustful, entrepreneurial guy to bring Zen to the U.S.
Right.
Yeah, the successor isn't necessarily the enlightened one, not necessarily. But one thing Mike and Blair both have in common, they're both great musicians. And where we came up with the monsters of Zen, as I said in jazz, we have these monsters like Thelonious Monk and Charlie Parker. So we have monsters in Zen too. Right. With these guys. They're so good, they're scary.
Yeah.
So that's where we come up with the monsters.
I get it.
Brennan, how about you?
I want to piggyback a little bit on what these three said. I think I can maybe tie that all together. The idea that the mirror does not have a stand, that's a very Diamond Sutra thing. That's like, you're cutting right to the root. You're really getting to the heart of it. And then the fact that, I believe what the poem said, where could dust hope to settle, or something of that effect?
Another translation says it like that.
No place where the dust is settled.
He said, where do you, the original, Original poem is always try to keep it clean. Don't let it
Right.
gather dust.
Right. And
Hui Ning's answer was, Buddha nature is forever pure. Where do you get all this dust?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's different.
It's,
You know,
yeah.
I believe I heard Dogen or read Dogen say something of like, it was like a response to Weinong's response,
Mhm.
which was the mirror without a stand shines bright with the light of Buddha nature, eliminating all dust in its view.
Okay. Well, that's interesting because there is a couple of passages where he uses lamps and light as a metaphor.
This
So-
is a point, by the way, a technical point that reading multiple translations is very helpful to
Right.
just sort of see into what all the connotations of the Chinese might have been.
Yeah.
I think the big point is there's no dust to eliminate in the first place.
No dust to illuminate in the first place. Is what yeah.
So Andrew, Casey. So April and Dominic.
Chop wood, carry water.
Would carry one.
Chop water, carry wood.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you for being here. Thanks for your attention.
We'll do the closing verse. So the 4 vows we do 3 times. Beings are numberless, I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible, I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless, I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is unsurpassable, I vow to realize it. Beings are numberless, I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible, I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless, I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is unsurpassable, I vow to realize it. Beings are numberless, I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible, I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless, I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is unsurpassable, I vow to realize it. Just a quick show of hands, how many can go to lunch? Tycoon? 2, 3, 4.
I won't be able to.
Thank you for your patience in listening, please. Oh, and Joseph, Cheryl, you may have the Tibetan thing in common. Look at, for instance, the Tibetan side.
And the Shankara thing is that is also